Getting wealthy off of killing Palestinians with Palantir kills Palestinians with their AI and technology.
Oh.
You're killing my family in Palestine.
Yeah. And
what kind of person are you? How do you sleep at night?
Well, if
Shame on you.
Do you want to hear my answer?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. So, I think the primary cause of death to Palestinians. Okay. Do you want to hear the answer, or do you want to yell?
For no reason.
Well, you don't want to hear an answer?
I want to hear
Obviously. So the primary source of death in Palestine is the fact that Hamas has realized that there are millions and millions of useful idiots.
AI and your technology from Palantir kills Palestinians.
Mostly terrorists. That's true.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. It's a bit hard to believe, but we're coming up on 4 months of turbulence. If you've been listening from the beginning, thank you. We will absolutely never forget our day ones. And if you are just tuning in for the first time, welcome. Your handwritten note from Seamus should be in the mail and arriving soon.
Okay. False promises are already being made without my permission. Nevertheless, over the past several months, we've put out public episodes covering a wide range of countries and conflicts like Yemen, Sudan, Gaza, Somalia, and more, and also conceptual deep dives such as into policing.
These episodes have largely been self-contained, though we've been following particular stories in an ongoing capacity in the bonus feed. But this week, we are starting something new. This episode is the first in a public series, The Political Economy of Genocide. So far, we've heavily focused on how states and non-state political actors are responding to and shaping our changing world. M, Seamus, and I have been discussing how we can broaden our analysis to include other players, namely private corporations, as a means to better educate the public about their role in the genocide and create a useful roadmap for those who are working to resist it. With this series, we'll be going sector by sector to explore different aspects of the military-industrial complex and asking the question, who materially makes genocide possible? Who builds it, ensures it, finances it, innovates it, and ultimately profits from it?
These networks are complicated by design, and it's our hope that over the course of this series, we'll be able to demystify the web of private interests that turn this mass violence into a highly profitable system. We'll still be responding to new events as they come in with our regionally specific and other conceptual episodes, so we'll be adding to this series gradually over the next several months, and if it goes well, we may do other new, different series as well.
To kick off the Political Economy of Genocide series, we're going in on Silicon Valley. For basically all of human history, technological innovation has been deeply intertwined with militarism. And that is no less the case for the particular era of technological advancement that we find ourselves in, namely the massive growth in computing and artificial intelligence.
We have always been ruled by evil magnates who have engaged in immense suffering, but this current crop of corporate overlords have been uniquely rich, uniquely powerful, and uniquely cringeworthy and desperate to be seen as awful. People like Elon Musk, Alex Karp, Sam Altman, and who can forget Palmer Luckey, the AI freak himself.
If you were having to require the human operator to actually map every single action and say, hey, do this, if that, then this, it would take so long to manage it that you would be better off just remotely piloting it. It's the AI on board all these weapons that makes it possible to make it so easy.
These freaks, and they are freaks, truly represent the cutting edge of social degradation. They've presided over the hollowing out of entire industries at the expense of the labor force that powers them. They've presided over large-scale environmental destruction through the construction of massively consumptive data centers. And they've presided over the production of truly horrific technologies of mass surveillance and, as we'll see, of genocide. To dig into these matters fully, we're joined today by Edward Ongweso Jr. Ed is a fantastic researcher and writer who's been covering the political economy of technology for quite a while. You should definitely check out his Substack, The Tech Bubble. I think I can speak for both of us when I say that this isn't really our area of expertise, so it was really incredible to have Ed walk us through the mess of companies and technologies and the individual freaks who run them.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we have the absolute pleasure of being joined by Edward Ongweso Jr., a writer and researcher with Security in Context, where he focuses on artificial intelligence. He's also a host of the podcast, This Machine Kills. Ed, thank you for joining us and welcome to Turbulence.
Thanks for having me. Excited to chat with you guys today.
Ed, you've been writing on tech for quite a while. Can you tell us a bit what inspired you to pick up this beat? And what would you say are the main animating questions of your work?
You know, I went to this hippy-dippy liberal arts college in Western Mass where you can, make your own major and course of study. There's a year where you're encouraged to do an independent project. And I got put into doing union organizing with Uber and Lyft drivers. It was at the company union that had been hijacked by a bunch of Marxists who were convinced, they could do some sort of militancy and maybe get like a strike going on in New York City. Being that I was, in college and I didn't really know much better. And also I didn't really know what other options there were. I joined in because I was pretty convinced. I was excited by the idea of doing some organizing, at least for Uber and Lyft drivers. Didn't work, obviously. But the experience of working with the drivers is pretty radicalizing. And also the experience of the gulf between what drivers talk to me about were their daily concerns. Meeting drivers in LaGuardia parking lot who would sleep in their cars, hadn't seen their family. They were in debilitating pain or their health was getting worse and they were pushing themselves to the edge just so that they could get starvation wages. And then seeing a lot of the reporting being like, I drove for Uber and it was kind of fun. I made a good amount of money on the side. There's just like a general ignorance of what the actual labor dynamics were, why the company existed, a bunch of mythology that was just corporate talking point. I did a very big ethnography on Uber and Lyft drivers in school, and then, leveraged that to get a tech reporting job with Motherboard, where the focus was labor and tech, and the main thrust of our work was, Silicon Valley. There's this sense that there was a tech lash at the time going on, but a lot of it was really analysis that was unmoored from what was actually going on, the finances, the business models, the labor conditions, and then the political aims. And the thrust of the work was just to try to explain what's actually going on instead of relying on, press releases and access interviews and narratives being presented and prepackaged by the industry itself, right? So I think that's more or less has been the thrust of my work. Then in that earlier phase, I was really concerned with the ways in which taxi drivers and ride-hail drivers were expected to sacrifice themselves to make Uber and Lyft run and eventually be profitable, right? There had been a string of suicides, as well as drivers who were just subsisting on starvation wages or below, on near minimum wages, or below minimum wages, to drive their car into the dirt and drive themselves into an early grave. And I think that more or less, this idea of sacrificing a large chunk of workers and people in general to make a technological innovation happen, or to make a certain business model profitable, is what I see happening in most of Silicon Valley, right? So I think this is where most of my work now lands at this point, trying to figure out why we're doing this, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Silicon Valley and the tech push in general is often a lot of these figures and corporations describing what they're doing as a disruption or as something that's new. But it sounds like on your narration, it's a very old story, which is the story of labor exploitation.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you see the tech wave that we're in as a fundamental political economic shift, or is it a repackaging of the kind of same models of exploitation that have permeated the economy for a long time?
Yeah, I mean, part of it is I think that, there's a lot of money to be made, but unfortunately, a lot of those ways of making it are illegal, right? And so one thing that tech capitalists have been eager to do is how we can re-legitimize old ways of making money. How can we roll back some regulations on labor, on environmental standards, on safety, on working conditions, on things that a company itself is even allowed to do, on financial regulations. And then there's another part of it where there are genuine technological developments, but to what end are they being deployed? A lot of the reasons why I'm skeptical to call it like a new shift, like a techno-feudalist thing or some sort of fundamental shift or disintegration of capitalism. A lot of this really just reads to me as we're trying to get back not just old forms of profit or old, profit margins, but old modes of domination and hierarchy, right? And, sometimes that's labor exploitation. Sometimes that's also subordination of the state, to ensure that we just get, our subsidies or we get our protections, or that we use it as a weapon against competitors or political rivals and so on and so forth. So, I think that while there's a lot of new things that are developing, they're all attempts to reaffirm or rediscover or re-legitimize older forms, older techniques, because the idea is if we can purify these and we can get back to, good old capitalism as it used to be.
You've described yourself as a neo-Luddite, which I think is a really interesting term. I think, most of us, when we hear the term Luddite, we're used to that as like a pejorative. Mm-hmm. And so I'm just wondering if you could speak a bit about what does it mean to be a neo-Luddite, or what does that mean in this particular moment?
Luddism, the way I think about it is that technology is a thing that's made. It has material politics in how its resources are extracted and how it gets designed and developed and deployed. And almost every single decision about how a technological artifact or technological product comes to us is done privately, right? By firms, by financiers, by policymakers. We're relatively insulated from what the public does or doesn't want. And so on a basic level, the idea of Luddism is that however we want to develop technology, it should have substantially more democratic input and oversight into this process. Because most of the times it's used, like we're talking about, by capitalists who are trying to reaffirm older relations that are more exploitative and profitable. But also comes with, I think, maybe a sort of inherent skepticism that my earlier years in journalism kind of put in me, which is that in general, a lot of people tend to just assume that what the corporation is saying or what the financiers are saying or what the people at the firm are saying is fine and true and the way that we want to organize things. technological developments, especially today, are being pushed so aggressively and so undemocratically by individuals with relatively nefarious political ends that you should not just mindlessly accept a new technological development, just as you would not mindlessly, or I hope mindlessly not accept a new political development, right? Or a new social relation that's being forced onto people, or a new economic system, right? Technology it's not a mindless march to some horizon that we're all going on together. We're being driven down pre-designed and directed paths, and we should reject them when we don't like where they're going. And we should be able to reject them, right? We should have my co-host Jathan talks about this a lot, politics of refusal, right? We should be able to say no and do something about it versus just saying no and maybe boycotting or pulling out. We should be able to demonstrably reject the technology, not implement it, pull it out if it's already implemented, and have some sort of process for deliberating what the alternative looks like and why there should be an alternative.
I just want to get a baseline before we get into a more involved discussion about this. What precisely is AI in the modern understanding of the phrase? Because when I was growing up, the perception was that AI was going to be this self-aware super intelligence that would operate independently and could fundamentally act and reason like a human could. Certainly, there are people who perceive current AI to be like that to the detriment of our society, but what are its actual properties?
Yeah, I think this is really good because there are unintentional and intentional slippery uses of the term, right? On a basic level, I think that we could say the idea behind artificial intelligence is that you would have some sort of artificially constructed system that is algorithmic. The attempt in the design is to mirror some parts of the human mind or the human nervous system that allow it to independently react to or generate or reason or something approximate to reason. I think more realistically, the term emerges as a catch-all for algorithmic processes that do tasks or that can break down tasks into patterns, maybe predict some of these patterns, maybe ascertain some patterns that can then be acted upon, right? Maybe a more concrete example would be that a lot of the times what we call artificial intelligence in surveillance systems may not be actually artificial intelligence, may just be a pretty data-intensive algorithmic or machine learning process. Whereas what we're talking about a lot of the times in our discussions about artificial intelligence today also are mixed in with these generative AI chatbots. There's a metaphor I really like that is an AI snake oil, which is a book that came out 2 years ago. And in it, they said, imagine if we lived in a society where all types of implements such as cars, trains, buses, rockets were all called vehicles. And we were expected to talk about them with the same sort of depth and nuance and make policy about them as if we were not grouping together wildly different things, right? There are some systems that we use to recommend things to people. There are some systems that we use to predict things about populations. There's some systems that we use to generate based on data sets that they already have. These are not all the same, but they're all lumped in together as artificial intelligence for one reason or another, usually for cynical reasons by the industry, because some systems are much more developed and more widely integrated into your daily lives or processes of a corporation than the newer ones, which they're trying to gen up excitement for, like generative AI.
I wonder if some of the confusion actually stems from like a confusion about what intelligence is in the first place. Part of it feels like a branding problem, and part of it feels like, well, there's all these cognitive functions that humans do that we describe as intelligence that are wildly different, like basic spatial awareness of how to exist in your own ecology, and then like cognitive reasoning or abstract reasoning are two totally different functions that we engage in as humans, but are both referred to as intelligence in some way, which I feel like kind of like preempts that level of confusion when we are trying to recreate that in machines.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think what's being sold are very specific types of intelligence, or the idea is the marketing is supposed to latch on very specific types of intelligence that are maybe one facet of it. The idea is that this will allow products that then connect with that to resonate more deeply with the deeper sense of human intelligence that we have, right? But this is something that comes up a lot where it's like, when we're talking about what artificial intelligence systems or what AI system, what all the systems under this umbrella catch-all term do, right? I mean, one way to think of it, I think Evgeny Morozov talks about it, is like bureaucratic notions, right? Bureaucratic intelligence, right? We've created a lot of systems that are really good at doing things that you would imagine some sprawling bureaucracy to be able to do. But humans are much more than that. And you would have no luck selling some sort of generative AI product that got bored, in the course of a conversation.
Right.
But, this is a fundamental part of how our minds work. Mm-hmm. There are only some elements of the mind that we have these companies trying to replicate, because they're not really actually interested in intelligence, right? This is part of a longer thread where it's, how do we create a sort of on-demand laborer that we can direct towards certain types of work? And, sometimes that's the work of discerning patterns. Sometimes that's the work of recommending things. Sometimes that's the work of doing creative or trying to give the semblance of generating creative things, right? Sometimes that's the work of compiling a bunch of data and labeling it and putting it into something that's readable and digestible. But the core part of it, right, is this confusion emerges because these firms are not being honest about what they're actually trying to develop and offer to people, I think.
But also sometimes they are, right?
Right. Yeah.
I just saw something very interesting because you said that they're actually trying to create a laborer, they are trying to reproduce labor. And I saw this interesting clip of Sam Altman, I think from today or yesterday, where someone asked him about the energy inputs behind some of these large language models or what have you, and he kind of was like, well, there's a lot of energy inputs that go into a human being. Yeah. He's like, think about all the food that they have to eat over their 20 years of life. And I'm like, oh yeah, you are just trying to reproduce a laborer. Yeah. And you're thinking about what their social reproduction takes and making that trade-off that way.
There's this book, I think, that does a great job at kind of mapping this out, that I was introduced to through Meredith Whittaker's essay in Logics. But the book is called, I think, Eye of the Master, right? And in it, they're trying to talk about how the origins of computation engines, as envisioned by Charles Babbage, come at a time where the British have just abolished slavery. And they are anxious because slavery yielded an immense amount of plunder and profit that they used to sustain their empire both at home and overseas. They need to figure out how to make new types of labor that are just as profitable. And they decide that what we should do is we need to make factory labor resemble plantation labor, right? Plantation labor would be thought of as this pastoral or maybe not particularly highly technical enterprise, but slave owners, right, and slave drivers, these guys spend a lot of time, trying to figure out how to terrorize people to do as much work as they wanted them to do, and how to get them to watch each other, how to get them to self-surveil, self-report, and had developed highly granular forms of terrorism as management to get this out of their slaves. And so the idea was, okay, well, how can we get the factory to resemble the plantation? And Charles Babbage comes in and says, look, the labor question that we need to solve has to involve some sort of engines that will allow us to divide labor into the smallest possible replicable task and quantify how much work everyone is doing and allow them to watch one another and empower managers to categorize, but also surveil, empower workers to self-report, but also to surveil one another as well, and kind of spread the eye, this eye of the master as wide across the factory as possible. So I think a really important thing is the origins of computation as we have it. And this latest iteration are bureaucratic in part because of the Cold War. But going back even further, we're talking about how do we replicate a certain type of laborer? And it really is how do we get the productivity that you would from a slave into something that's not a slave, right? This is the thing that Western philosophy has been concerned about all the time. Of course you need slaves in a society, but it's immoral to have slaves. So what are we going to do about that? Make them robots, or make non-living processes that are autonomous and independent that can just do it, right?
If we're talking about total freaks, I think this is a great segue to start talking about Palantir.
Yes.
Because when I think of an evil corporation, in my mind, I think in the minds of most people, my mind immediately goes to Palantir, which I believe is named after some sort of entity from the Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I want to say. Alex Karp in particular really interests me because I think Sam Altman and other AI-related CEOs, they're maybe a bit awkward, but I think they do measure what they say to a certain extent. Whereas Alex Karp, just as a selection, he called pro-Palestine protesters, quote, an infection, unquote. comparing them to a pagan religion, that Western values are the superior ways to live. He says he spends a lot of time talking to quote unquote real Nazis. I wanted to ask, what should people know about Alex Karp, and what should people know about Palantir and how it's placing its thumbs on the DHS, the American military, Israel's military, and all these other tendrils of Western civilization?
Yeah, no, I think Alex Harp is a grade A freak, right? This is one of the top 5 on the enemy list. I mean, this is someone who calls himself the last socialist because he thinks that he's the only one who understands that you have to develop some sort of nationalist identification with the United States. And you have to build up the most powerful weapons possible. And you have to build up a technological armament that terrifies and scares the shit out of everybody so that no one tries anything and that you can develop the homeland as you see fit,
Wow, a radical idea. I never heard of that
we
before.
can unify these two things, some sort of social nationalism or nationalism.
It's
this could really change things.
Listen, it really could change things. He studied in Germany for a while, so do with that as you will. But he's interesting, right? Because he's interesting on a few levels. I think one thing to look at, his latest book, well, he co-authored it with his chief legal counsel, which was probably a fun process to write, but it's called The Technological Republic. On the one hand, it's very thin and it's full of shit because it's a sales pitch, right? The sales pitch is Palantir trying to convince its readers, who I assume would be policymakers or state bureaucrats or other people in tech who might convince their firms to invest in buying it on the enterprise end and grafting it onto their workflow. He's trying to say, look, like, as we're saying, we need to do this radically new thing where we have to develop the most powerful weapons ever because we have a disadvantage since we have all these morals that prevent us from using them, but our enemies don't have the morals. And so they'll use them, right? Unless we have them first. And that to defend our civilization, but also Western civilization, these tools need to be terrifying. So they need to be autonomous weaponry that can assassinate people from afar. They need to be digital weapons that can be able to destabilize regimes.
Palantir is here to disrupt and make the institutions we partner with the very best in the world, and when it's necessary, to scare enemies and on occasion kill them. And we hope you're in favor of that. We hope you're enjoying being a partner. And we're really happy and very, very focused on what we're doing.
And to do this, there are a bunch of things we have to do at home. We have to change the way corporations allow their workers, a woke minority of their workers, to hijack a company agenda and prevent them from building weapons because they're concerned that they'll be used to kill people. We need to foster patriotism that gets people invested in technology itself, because technology is not only a means for liberating ourselves from geopolitics, but it's a way for us to improve. These are also arguments you might make elsewhere, but it's a way for us to just improve relations between people, right? If we have a better communication infrastructure, if we have better surveillance systems, if we have better networks connecting one another. And one way to think about Palantir is this kind of project to say, we are interested in building the foundation for a deeply pervasive and robust surveillance infrastructure that will be leveraged against America's enemies broadly, whether they're domestic, non-white migrants, or international, right? If they are Palestinians, if they are Russians in the Ukraine and Russia war, if they are, whoever a Western nation wants to use our tools to deploy them against. We can think of that as like some of the basic blocks that have to do with Karp and his sense of what role he plays in Western civilization, or what role he plays in developing tech. And to that end, right, for a long time, Alex Karp has been offering and selling and integrating his product to Department of Homeland Security, right? Specifically to ICE and specifically to HSI and ERO. For years, it has been clear that Palantir has been instrumental in trying to build a robust set of tools that allow agents to visualize maps of where people are that they can support, to have UIs or apps or information systems that pull data from as many sources as possible to determine the address, the likelihood that they're there, jobs they may have, places where you can get as many people as possible to round up and deport, or to places that you can visit to terrorize migrant communities so that you can get them to self-deport. I think is also linked to the ideas that he's embraces become more and more of a reactionary, which is that whether you're liberal, whether you're conservative, the thing that matters is the national body, and things like mass migration are adjutants. And so, maybe it's uncomfortable work, maybe it's a moral work, but we care about the country more than we care about, the people inside of it. And so, one way to make the body politic cohere better is you empower domestic agencies and police forces with as many surveillance and a remote control and remote killing instruments as possible so that they can fortify the homeland, right?
Does it have any sort of relationship with Israel directly, other than just the DHS?
Yeah, Karp has been one of the executives that's been pretty loud and proud about work that it has with Israel, right? Karp has been eager to say, hey, we support Israel and our tools are used as part of the, and we can talk about the massive armament of AI tools and weaponry that Israel has used in its genocide, but that we are a key tool or key infrastructure here, as part of what Palantir and Karp and others would insist they offer is the ability to take surveillance data and intelligence from all these sources that you might not know you had access to or that yielded insight into things, pull them together, collate them together, and generate kill lists, right? And you can use these kill lists ostensibly to target specific groups of people. But, as we've seen for the past few years, any sort of generated kill lists are just used as rationale to flatten entire neighborhoods and kill as many people as possible. So, on the one level, you could think of Palantir's offering ostensibly like a new piece of information technology that allows a vendor, that allows a government, that allows a police authority to generate kill lists, and that this is a frightening authoritarian development in of itself. But it also offers a new cover, right? Because the idea is, well, if it was generated, if we had a targeted attack because of a generated list that we use this sort of surveillance technology from, it's legitimized, right? In a way that goes a bit further than if the government just says, they were all terrorists. Well, because it's the machine that's doing it and not so much the person.
It's interesting. We're talking about these tech firms kind of operating as the reactionary cutting edge, giving the government forces the ideological cover and kind of pushing in that reactionary direction. But there's also been some reporting cutting in the other direction that I just want to get your take on. In particular, there's been recent reporting on friction between a corporation called Anthropic, which I believe has a kind of strategic partnership with Palantir in terms of providing some of these technologies, in particular to the Pentagon, for all kinds of military and intelligence purposes. But apparently, and this is again according to the reporting, Anthropic has been insisting on some kind of ethical guardrails around the involvement of their technology in mass surveillance or in weapons that can fire autonomously without any kind of human intervention. So I'm curious, what is your read on that situation in particular? Because, on the one hand, if it's real, it's quite terrifying that the ethical backstop, insofar as there is one, is coming from private tech companies and not coming from the government itself.
This is an interesting one, right? Where Anthropic has had ties with national security for a while now. 2024, 2025, I was working with Palantir, as you said, to provide Claude secretly. And this was probably one of the first, if not the first, large language models that were allowed to operate within the U.S. military, but not just the U.S. military, but within its classified networks, right? As a way to, do this sort of collation of data from a diverse range of sources. And then, Anthropic gets a $200 million contract with the DoD that entails it working for the next 2 years on frontier AI capabilities that are going to enhance national security, right? On the one hand, it's interesting because it's very clear Anthropic has been very interested in using and offering its product and services to the government, to the public sector, to develop, in a very real way, develop its capacity to deploy force and, lethal force, right? So the ethical guardrails are interesting to me because there are a few ways I think about it. Part is I feel like these things are sort of a PR move in that Anthropic makes a bit of noise about its commitment to, more so than other firms, I would say, but its commitment to ensuring that artificial intelligence is not going to escape from a lab and kill everybody if it's not aligned with values that human beings have. But I think it's also important to note people like Brian Merchant, for example, have talked about how this constant invocation of the risk of artificial intelligence, of being a malicious actor, is in of itself a marketing strategy and a very lucrative one, right? if you could constantly show how powerful your technology is, and Anthropic does this, how easy it would be for someone, a motivated actor, to use your technology to hijack crypto tokens, and you could then make this claim and say, well, they could launder them. So some terrorist group could steal hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto tokens, launder them, and use them to fund their activities. And this is a national security threat. The way to solve that is to further invest in us so we have the resources to be able to stop this security threat, right? That our own product is going to have. And it also gives you a way to attract investors because you're saying, well, look at how much we are investing in containing our risky product, right? The option here should not be to stop developing it. It should be to develop it even further so that we have more control over it. And I think similarly, these deals with the Defense Department and then insisting on ethical guardrails feel the same to me. On the one hand, we have concerns about the ability of the government to develop tools and be able to kill people without some sort of human in the loop. And that raises ethical concerns. But at the same time, we're also fine with developing the capacity to do so if there's a human in the loop, right? So it's,
Right.
And if there's a human in the loop, we would love to do so, right? So you should bring us in for that. So on a fundamental level, I think that it feels a bit like a PR move. And then there's also the question of, this is a narrow difference to kind of die on a hill, but it's a lucrative one. I think it's a smart move if you're an AI firm to, at this point, position yourself as one that might be concerned about Trump administration's directions because, there's going to be a backlash. There's going to be a political backlash to artificial intelligence if a Democrat gets in power. And a firm like Anthropic, even though it's already collaborated with the Defense Department, even though it's already collaborated with Palantir, it would still be able to position itself as a firm that has ethical concerns and maybe avoid sort of a crusade that might come in a few years. But, we'll see. I'm not convinced. Yeah.
I wanted to ask more generally about AI in Israel, because I saw this yesterday that Netanyahu opened work on this new airport in the Negev desert alongside this racist, disgraced, ultra-far-right former member of the Knesset, Almog Cohen. And alongside talking about the achievement of being able to open this airport because so much of Hamas's rocket arsenal has been destroyed, that this airport would bring in AI development because Israel needs to advance in the AI space.
מדינת ישראל היא אבן שואבת, יש לה כלכלה ברמה עולמית, והיא תמשיך לגדול ולגדול ולגדול בעידן ההייטק, בעידן ה-AI, אנחנו גדלים במהירות, וכשאתה גדל מהר אתה מקבל מיליונים שרוצים להגיע, והם צריכים לנחות ולהמריא.
We've touched briefly on these AI programs that the IDF uses. I don't think we named it particularly, but Lavender, that system that the IDF uses. But what does Israel in particular want to get out of AI? Why does it want to position itself so strongly in this space? Why does it want to be the beating heart of the AI industry?
I think part of what is at play here is recognition of political backlash that could mobilize or demobilize unconditional support of Israel in the United States. Could be hedged with becoming an AI hub, right? I think this kind of rhymes with, for example, Saudi Arabia and, the GCC, the Gulf countries that are oil producers or client states of Saudi Arabia. These countries are saying, hey, look, we are seeing that there's a potential for the world to reduce the amount of oil demand that it has. So part of the basic position of this cartel is that we don't want that to happen, right? So we're going to try to invest in supporting and expanding oil demand or deepening oil reliance across the world, but also making hedges in both our own energy sources and in fields that allow us to secure the same sort of geopolitical importance that we enjoy because of oil. And one field that might secure as much geopolitical importance as oil does currently is making yourself a hub for artificial intelligence, whether that's for talent to developing it, whether that's for infrastructure and hosting it, because there is already massive backlash to the attempt to proliferate data centers, right? Saudi Arabia has a pretty authoritarian regime that would easily crush any attempt to mobilize against data centers there. And that's going to be attractive in the years to come to AI firms that feel they're constrained in compute or whatever. And I think so similarly, these are reasons that might motivate Israel's desire to get into artificial intelligence. There's a lot of geopolitical importance that can be derived if you're occupying a relatively high part of the value chain in the AI sector. But I think also artificial intelligence is very important to Israel, or it flows out of importance to Israel, because this is a chance for it to cultivate even deeper ties, not just with the United States, but with other countries. Israel currently enjoys a lot of relationships with a lot of countries because it uses its constant genocides, invasions, occupations of Gaza and Palestine over the years, right, to develop weaponry, develop techniques, domination and terrorizing the population to export into other parts of the world. And so I think part of the idea here is also if we can draw in capital to develop our AI systems, especially because we've been experimenting with certain AI systems, and the most recent, genocide that has been ongoing, where we are using Lavender, we're using Gospel, we're using Where's Daddy? I mean, we can talk about the individual systems, but where we're using countless systems to try and develop a multi-layered artificial intelligence infrastructure that is really just a kill chain. Other countries are going to be interested in it. India is going to be interested in this. Russia would be interested in this. Any sort of regime that you can imagine that has to deal with domestic turmoil is going to be interested in this. So on a basic level, there's also the interest in exporting this. And then there's also the interest in just using it at home, right? If we can develop these AI systems for surveillance and for warfare, this will also allow us to suppress and destroy, right, and ethnically cleanse Palestinians, right? So there are a lot of reasons why Israel would be interested geopolitically, domestically, even economically, in drawing investors and drawing talent and drawing international assistance and building up infrastructure for AI, right?
Could you briefly touch on what Gospel and Daddy's Home are for people who aren't aware of them?
Let's start with Lavender, right? So Lavender, we can think of as a way to algorithmically classify human targets, right? And the idea here is for Lavender, they would assign a numerical rating based on your statistical likelihood of being a member of Hamas, right? How would they generate this rating? They would use a bunch of data streams from disparate, parts of someone's digital wake, or even other documents and information that they had on them that was unrelated to what their digital footprint might be, right? So you might use cellular metadata, so these are your call records, your location history. You might do an analysis of their social network, right? What WhatsApp groups are they a member of? Who is in their contacts? What are the networks of people that they're connected to in their contacts? Let's look at their finances. What are the transaction records looking at? Do we have actual data on their movement through biometric surveillance that we have already established? Where are they going and when they're going? You use this rating system to then automatically flag people for inclusion on kill lists that are being generated, right? And Lavender came up partly because of 972 Mag's reporting, where they talked about how there's a threshold for a rating at which Israel would say, okay, let's put them on a kill list and kill them. And when they exhausted the people on these kill lists, they then lowered the threshold and then authorized targeting people with increasingly lower likelihoods or ratings as now likely members of Hamas. And what this ended up doing is if you're lowering the threshold perpetually and continually, you go from, even in their own rationale, right? They would say, you go from targeting very specific individuals to now hitting apartment buildings, schools, right? Places where a lot of people live who are going to have this nebulously constructed rating system or rating assigned to them. So Lavender was supposed to be this incredibly precise tool and really just ended up being used to justify kind of explosion in the size of kill lists.
Yeah, what it seemed to be is that the Israelis were just exhausting their target banks faster than they could be generated. Mm-hmm. And so as opposed to the AI kind of directing the assassinations, it seems to me like what it was doing was producing a post hoc justification for the kind of mass slaughter that they were intent on engaging in the first place.
Right. When you look at the verification process also, you look at something for 20 seconds, you pass it on, and you look at the target's gender, and it's only if the gender's female, then you say that's an error because, all the militants, all the targets are going to assume that they're men, right? So if that's the only time you get it flagged is if they're not men. I think that is even more to your point, right? Where we're going to judge the machine outputs as correct, maybe have some arbitrary categories or line cases where it might be an error, and we're just going to use it because at the end of the day, what we're really concerned with is kill lists. We're concerned with killing as many people as possible. This is a system that helps us justify what we probably would have done without the kill list. I can't imagine that if they didn't have AI systems, they would not still have engaged in an incredibly destructive bombing campaign and tried to ethnically cleanse as many people as they could. But now that they have the AI system, it becomes this debate about, well, was it that it kind of legitimizes, like we're talking about, legitimizes the output a little bit more because the idea is a machine did this, and the failure was that there weren't enough humans in the loop. If there would have been more humans looking at this, assessing it, we would have realized the threshold was too low.
If we're talking about human involvement, I think this is a good segue. In the final days of the war in 2025 between Israel and Iran, the Iranian military hit a technology park in Beersheba in southern Israel that was being used both as a cyber warfare base for the IDF, but also as a local headquarters for Microsoft. Mm-hmm. I've seen various threats here and there against American companies for their interlocking relationships with the IDF. I remember distinctly there was a member of Ansar Allah's political bureau who threatened the HP plant in Kiryat Gat with what sounded like a ballistic missile strike. You see, he posted that on Twitter in Hebrew. But can you go into more detail about the relationships that the IDF has with Microsoft, with Google, and with other major American firms that I think have a less evil perception than Palantir or OpenAI?
One key project is Project Nimbus, right? This is the cloud infrastructure of the occupation. And this has been one of the more important pieces of technology without which they could not do any of their actions, and they could not have escalated this. Project Nimbus starts April 2021, where the Israeli government signs this $1.2 billion cloud computing contract with Google and with Amazon Web Services. And so the idea here is this is going to allow us to build out cloud infrastructure, artificial intelligence, and machine learning services that are going to be provided to the entirety of the Israeli government, including the Ministry of Defense, including military, including intelligence services. This is going to also create cloud regions within Israel and make sure that Israel has sovereignty over the data. All the data is going to stay within their jurisdiction. It's shielded. This is important because it shields it from attempts to look at the data, to subpoena the data, to have any real attempt at accountability mechanisms are blocked immediately. And it also includes anti-boycott clauses that are these provisions which prevent Google and Amazon from suspending services regardless of whatever political developments, human rights violations, humanitarian crises, war crimes. No matter what happens, you have to guarantee continuity of service. And so Nimbus becomes increasingly important, especially after October 2023, where we see that the Israeli military internal cloud infrastructure gets overwhelmed, right? It's overwhelmed because they are now trying to take all the sheer volume of data that they have in their expansive surveillance apparatus, drone footage, targeting data, surveillance intercepts, old and new AI systems that they're trying to build up to generate kill lists. And so Nimbus steps in along with Microsoft Azure, which is their cloud computing infrastructure, to provide additional overflow capacity for the cloud infrastructure. And this is important because I think also the contract that begins to emerge, as does the relationship between the Microsoft, Amazon, and Google, to not just provide this infrastructure, but also actively provide new products and services, new AI, and new machine learning tools that can be on demand used to handle more surveillance, that can be used to support more targeting systems, like Lavender, as we talked about, and like the additional ones, which we can get to, like Gospel, like Where's Daddy, and so on and so forth, right? Nimbus we should think of it as maybe a platonic ideal, I guess, of the relationships between Israel and the United States tech firms, right? Because we got, I think recently, leaked internal Google documents that showed the executives knew that the cloud services were being used for war crimes, knew they were being used for human rights violations, but again, were concerned and said that actually we need to explicitly prioritize profit here, right? Financial and strategic imperatives being closer collaboration and ties with Israel. Microsoft Azure also provides, engineering support for Unit 9200 cloud storage infrastructure for its mass surveillance programs.
Just for folks, Unit 8200 is the highly specialized military intelligence unit of the IDF.
And one example, right? This is a system that is deployed to intercept, right, millions of phone calls that are going on daily, right? And it cannot do this without the cloud storage infrastructure that's being provided by Azure. Sometime in June 2024, Microsoft has provided close to 20,000 hours of engineering and consulting support to the Israeli military, has embedded technical staff within military units, and has expanded Azure storage capacity for military intelligence use. Has also been important because they have, Google and Amazon, been trying to ensure that there is a new cloud region within Israel. This is a long-term commitment to collaborating on security infrastructure. This is a long-term commitment to ensuring they get data sovereignty so that they can be immune from data requests, from subpoenas, from any attempt, again, at any external or international justice brought against the Israelis. And I think also Azure here, like AWS, like Google, has enthusiastically stepped up to help Israel with generating its kill list and identifying targets for strikes. They announced recently like a partial suspension of services for Unit 8200, but it will most likely end up being, or looking like it ends up being, a nothing burger, right? Because other military units are still getting service. The broader contract is uninterrupted, and the infrastructure that they've set up over the past few years is still there.
And I want to ultimately return to Nimbus and Azure and the cloud computing contracts, but if you could just spell out for folks, because we've mentioned them, we talked about Lavender, but if you could just spell out Gospel and Where's Daddy on the Israeli side and kind of what those programs are.
Yeah, Gospel, is another program that presents itself as like this geospatial intelligence fusion. And the idea is that here, instead of assigning numbers to people, creating this threshold, which they're going to go on a list, we are going to target buildings and infrastructure, right? And so we'll take satellite imagery, we'll do some drone footage, we're going to do some intelligence intercepts, and use this to create a larger unified targeting database of buildings and of infrastructure, right? And this is a system that is part of a few older projects during 2021 and during Guardian of the Walls operation. Gospel was used then to kind of generate, lists of hundreds of targets per day, hundreds of buildings that could be targeted infrastructure, as opposed to the amount they would normally generate, which would be like maybe 50 or 100 each year through the traditional intelligence methods. As a sidebar here also, one thing to think about in the reporting of how these AI systems are augmenting the generation of targets, like you talked about, and like some people have talked about with 972 Mag's reporting. Part of the idea is there's some marketing there in this. We are now using AI to generate even more targets than we might have otherwise before. But, as we've been talking about, and as is clear and has been clear for years now, Israel is not limiting itself, right, to 50, 100 targets a year, even if that might be the number it claims it could only do before it got these automated systems embedded inside of its operations, right? So the Gospel is now, it's integrated into this thing called the Fire Factory, where they tried to create this AI factory, essentially, which would automate data streams and intelligence into targets that they could hit almost immediately, right? So you would identify some structure and say, hey, this is a military target now. And then the algorithms would categorize the buildings saying, oh, this is residential, this is weapon storage, this is command center. We're going to rank them and then automate the strikes. To what end? By mid last year, right, they had already leveled close to 80% buildings in Gaza, right? And again, we see the same thing where it's like the goal was already to destroy as much as possible and level everything. With the use of these automated systems, you have justification for that because you can say, oh, well, there's some networks that we determined are overlapping in these buildings. And so that's why we gave it a prioritized ranking and authorized a strike to disrupt potential networks, so on and so forth, Where's Daddy also similarly is this idea where one of the more, I think, monstrous systems where they have something they call the target location problem, right? Which is that how do we hit people who are constantly moving around? So what they would do is they would take data, cellular location data, try to deploy behavioral algorithms to predict when a target is going to be in a specific location, specifically when they're going to be at home and when they're not going to be at home. And then we will specifically calibrate this so that the timing is going to be when they enter a family home, because then we can maximize the probability of destroying the residents, of killing the family members, and of hitting them in a place where they're going to stay for a while. And so we can integrate this with other systems, with Gospel and with Lavender, to generate lists, kill lists that are, when are they at home? When are they with their family? When are they with someone else's family? And when can we kill as many people as possible?
It is just striking the Nazism of
yes,
it all.
Yeah.
Really, I just have to say, it's clear that what they are looking to do is mass slaughter civilians, level every building in the place, and yet they invest all of this money and technology and computing infrastructure to come up with a justificatory system for it.
Because that's what it is, right? Yeah.
Because that's what it is, right? It is really these kill lists are, they are to support and justify the carpet bombing, which is the clear political project there. So it's just quite remarkable in that regard. But I wanted to come back to Nimbus and Azure because that has been the site of a significant amount of resistance from workers within the industry. And I just, I wanted to touch on that because, even before October 7th, there has been a campaign around Project Nimbus, the No Tech for Apartheid campaign, where Google and Amazon workers are objecting to their employers' participation in Project Nimbus and sharing these cloud computing softwares, doing this cloud computing for Israel. And that resistance has also kind of expanded in recent years around tech corporations' involvement with DHS and ICE. So I just wanted to get your sense of what are the forms of dissent that you're seeing from within the industry, and how do you think tech workers ought to orient themselves to their firm's participation in war and all of these other atrocities?
I think that it's been staging internal protests, right? It has been leaking documents to the press. These are efforts that are good and encouraging and necessary, right? But it is also, as we've been talking about it, it's hard to disrupt because these companies, there are two things that happen. One is that since the initial wave of tech worker activism have learned a few things, right? They've learned that it's better to immediately fire people who are internally agitating than to risk some sort of movement emerging or any shift in company culture or any sort of internal conflict that would prioritize more money for them. I think, secondly, they've also learned that one way to avoid the ability of workers to not just protest, but sabotage, because over the years we have had workers, try to do what they can to gum up the works. But one way to do this is, divide the labor as much as possible, right? And make it so that people working on these things are not talking to each other, are not really tuned in enough or aware enough of what it is they're working on. You don't know why you're working on this specific computer vision project. You don't know why you're working on this specific drone project. You don't know why you're working on this specific, maybe behavioral algorithmic assistance, so on and so forth, right? The idea being, if we can divide the labor as much as possible, and if we can be pretty brutal in gutting an individual or a network that we think is going to be trying to agitate workers to oppose this, plainly immoral thing, because it gets in the way of our financial and strategic imperatives, we have to do it. So the moment that we're at is that it is absolutely essential for tech workers to try and figure out what is the lever with which they can pull and stop the firms they're working in from working on these things. The only reason that Israel is able to do the genocide is because of these firms, right? Or the only reason that it's able to, I would say, to do it with so much impunity. These firms have given it the sort of cover by having these technological armaments. And these firms have also created this additional legal layer around the data and around the weaponry and around the information, around the processes that form or don't form whatever they're doing to generate a kill chain, right? But these firms have, because they dealt with worker uprising, so the past few years, have really insulated themselves in a way that is going to prove to be very difficult. And, I don't particularly have an answer on what to do about that, right? On some level, we need as many lone wolves as possible in there to just go in some of these companies and leak as much as possible or, go heads down and stay as long as possible to get as much as possible. But also on the other hand, as we've been talking about, they have built very extensive infrastructure. They've also given Israel the technical knowledge to probably continue some of these operations, albeit at a lower clip if contracts were cut. And they've also helped Israel in, as we've been talking about, like attracting interest from venture capitalists, from other governments in building up an industry that would allow Israel to sustain itself and sustain these operations, even if Microsoft and Azure and Amazon and Palantir and IBM and Hewlett-Packard were not there to support the genocide and the infrastructure necessary for it. So, on the tech worker question, it's just hard for me. I'd be curious what you guys think, right? Because it is some of the most encouraging stuff, but it's also encouraging partly because of how well these firms have insulated themselves from any sort of risk and really from any sort of pressure, and have made it clear they don't really care. They're assisting and they're complicit in a genocide. In fact, they see this as a massive business opportunity.
Yeah, I think that there's real limitations to thinking about it narrowly as a labor issue, in part because of the dynamics that you're naming, in part because I don't think that there's any guarantee that framing the kind of moral questions and implications of what these firms are doing as a labor demand is going to be successful, for all of the reasons why it's hard to treat kind of traditional weapons manufacturers as first and foremost a labor issue. And so I do think that, it'll take some form of agitation, leaking, and sabotage from within, and some form of those strategies from the outside, and probably some level of coordination between the inside and the outside. But I do think that the main strategic orientation has to be, yes, how can we gum up the works? How can we sabotage what these firms are doing? And how can we expose the level of complicity that they're engaged in? And I think that kind of has to be the mission going forward.
I just want to also respond politely to Ed, and to also note to M to cut this, but legally I cannot mention what I think.
Me and you probably have the same thoughts on this.
Don't worry, y'all. I'm a lawyer, so I'll make sure no one gets in trouble.
Right.
I'll do the beep.
Yeah.
That's always fun to do.
Please do.
Yeah. Ed, I want to kind of close us out by talking about the future a bit. So, as we've referenced, there's all kinds of fears expressed when it comes to AI in particular around sentience. And you hear this from Silicon Valley types all the time, like somehow we're going to end up in the Matrix timeline or something. And we've kind of already in this conversation talked about how there are kind of PR and bottom line reasons why they might want to press on these fears, which is really fascinating. But it just kind of like overall strikes me as maybe something kind of dumb to worry about, because they don't seem to be generating life with large language models. Like they seem to be generating large language models. And also because like you can just unplug the computer if it gets too scary. I've just always held this that you can just do that. But a lot of what we have been talking about is genuinely terrifying. And as we look forward to a future that is likely to be increasingly defined by governments regulating flows and containments of populations, I feel that there are a lot of technological risks that we have to take very seriously. And so my question for you is, what are you afraid of when you look to the future?
I'm worried about a bunch of things. A lot of people insist that artificial intelligence is the real risk, for threats that it might have to the labor markets, the threat it might have if it becomes sentient and escapes. But like you said, with good reason, I think those things are secondary. My real concern is that climate change gets sidelined in favor of bolstering artificial intelligence capabilities. And then we are looking at, as the ecological niche that we enjoy disintegrates, a bunch of governments taking notes from Israel's success in committing a genocide with no consequence and proceed to do the same. On a basic level, this is already what is happening right now, in that the weaponry and the techniques that they develop and practice on Palestinians are exported to other regimes across the world. But I think also as the fusion of some of these frontier capabilities with algorithmic systems, with biometric surveillance, with remote killing and assassination, with mass assassination. As these get developed and exported, that this is what we're going to see more of, right? That you can justify building this out because you have a contract and you have to fulfill the contract. This is what capitalism is all about. And at the same time, here and in other countries, you have a push of tech capitalists who are saying the real impediment to technological progress is democracy in one way or another. And the things that we have developed to make democracy work, right? Universal suffrage is an issue, right? The development of these sort of basic rights that people have around, that have created an expectations that we built our societies around, that prioritize people over things, and rhetorically, are a problem. And that the future is going to end up with a bunch of different people trying to develop the right path to the most authoritarian, algorithmically empowered system in hopes of making it permanent, right? And that's really the thing I'm terrified of, figuring out a way to successfully purge democracy in the name of saving capitalism and using the technologies that we have now to do permanent surveillance, permanent remote control, permanent mass killing and permanent projection of force to anyone and everyone who doesn't fit whatever political project our freaks in power want to force upon us.
All right. Well, I think we now know what we have to fight like hell to prevent from happening.
Yeah.
Ed, this has been a really excellent conversation. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
And thank you so much for having me on.